Hey everyone, hope all you Ramaz students are enjoying the beginning of your Pesach vacation. Wanted to share with you a short thought today, something that I found interesting when I think about Pesach and the Haggadah and the experience that we recreate every year. So as we all know, walk into the library at Ramaz and speak above a mute whisper, and right away someone comes out, the teacher on library duty or the librarian, and tells you, you need to be quiet, this is a library. That's something that's kind of inherent to our culture and our age. But this wasn't always the case. In fact, during the Middle Ages, libraries were places that were very vocal. Sound was not a distraction. Sound was an inherent part of the experience of being around manuscripts in those days and the beginning of the printed text about a century later. And the reason this was so was because books and texts were so rare that often whole communities or whole groups of people only had access to one text. So when that text was read or discussed, it had to happen in a verbal discourse, oral setting. There was no such thing as silent reading or a private relationship with the text. Our relationship with the text was public and communal. In fact, we find that in Oxford, it was as late as 1412 that we first see a regulation introduced that a library needed to be a quiet place. And this was only a result of the fact that manuscripts started to become more common, and especially with the onset of the printing press, as people began to own their own text, all of a sudden the individual relationship with the text or the private relationship with the written word was created. Up until that point, there were no such thing as legal documents. There were, people focused on verbal agreements, things like tefillah or discourse or any sorts of types of reading or communal experiences really happened together. Makes me think a little bit of when I walk into Sephardic tefillah, when everything is kind of done communally and we don't have the kind of private, silent aspect, and we didn't have that Ashkenazi tefillah developed. Everything was done in public. Now, what's interesting about this kind of history of silent reading is that some scholars point to the fact that the ability to read on one's own or to create a private relationship with the text actually introduced the idea in some ways of the ability to think more on your own. And they actually point to the heresies or the beginning of heretical movements of the 1600s as an ability for someone to sit in a room, read a text, and mull over it on their own, as opposed to only thinking about it in public. You're more apt to think on your own when you're doing silent reading, and silent reading almost emboldened the reader because it placed the source of his curiosity completely under his own control and not in a group setting. So in many ways, there are lots of interesting things that we can talk about in terms of the development of silent reading, reading on one's own, thinking on one's own, and there are many wonderful things about this type of hitbodedut, of being able to kind of go out and think silently and interact with the text on your own. But our tradition, and Jewish tradition, really has always emphasized the idea of the two must go together. That too much silent reading, too much emphasis on being able to read and sit in a room on your own and mull and think about things on your own, while wonderful on many levels, removes you, to an extent, and if exacerbated, removes you from the community. And Jewish tradition, at its very basis, the idea that we have a Torah shebechtav, a text that we all interact with, but also a Torah shebe'al peh, that we're forced to interact publicly and communally and not fully on our own with that text, is really kind of the basis of this idea of how our tradition has tried to meld the two. Open, vocal, communal discourse, and the way I think about things in my own private tradition, in my own private way of thinking about things. Think about the way the Gemara works. It's a text. You can read it on your own, but the very text itself is a dialogue between Rabbanim, between people in our history. The text itself is the Rabbanim talking to each other. And we've always had this kind of dynamic interpolation of text and oral tradition. There is no place where I think you see this more than the very idea of what goes on the Seder night and in the telling of the Haggadah. First of all, Haggadah, lehagid, etymologically related to the word neged, two people across from each other who must be there together in order to have that conversation, who must tell it to each other. It must be a dialogue. What we do on the night of the Seder is we have this text. Sure, you could sit in a room and read it on your own quietly, but instead, we all come together and have a communal, oral relationship with this text in which we all interact together with it. Rav Hutner, the 20th century Rosh Yeshiva of Yeshivat Chaim Berlin, also author of the well-known Sefer Pachad Yitzchak, tells us that he plays on the word lechem oni for matzah, and he relates the word oni, which we normally refer to as poor man's bread, ani, to the verb la'anot, or to answer, or to respond. And he says lechem oni is bread in which we are obligated to respond to the bread, to talk to the bread. We are obligated to all be in a room together as a community to talk about what we're doing, not just to sit down and eat lechem oni, but la'anot, to respond, to talk, to answer the bread, to talk together as every aspect of it. And that's really what we do on the Seder night as a community. We get together and we talk about things. And the value of this, there are so many different things we can talk about what the value of talking out loud, aloud, in this way is. But I thought, kind of to end this off, that one very interesting way to talk about the value of oral reading or oral discussion as opposed to silent reading is something Aviva Zornberg mentions in her book Particulars of Rapture, in which she says, first she points out that the word Pesach itself, if you do a little switch of the samach and a sin, you get Pesach, a mouth that discusses. So the very aspect of Pesach is the fact that we all come together with a Pesach. And then she points out and she says, and I don't think I could do any better than quoting her actual words. She says, language is the very means by which the imprisoned heart gains freedom. As in the psychoanalytic model, speaking of many things, one comes by indirection at the core. This is a very modern idea of psychoanalysis, that the fact that you come and you talk and talk and talk for as long as it takes you to talk about all of your experiences, that is cathartically your road to freedom, because it allows you to truly encounter that experience and relate to it and understand it in a way that you never could if you just sat quietly and read about it. So in that sense, the idea of the oral tradition of Pesach, the fact that we get together and we talk and we don't only focus on the silent reading, is one that historically, psychologically, traditionally, is one that is very meaningful, very powerful, and very beautiful. Chag Sameach, everybody.